One of them was this problem that churches were articulating in their responses was that they couldn't really identify many young people who were interested in going into music ministry. Because I think for a lot of us, not all of us, but I think for a lot of us who ended up in music ministry or music ministry adjacent, that interest and passion usually begins pretty young. But I do wonder, what is it that is feeding that problem? Why is there a shortfall? Is this like a temporary thing? Is this a problem of, musical culture in churches more broadly? There is more interest in cultivating something choral. I'm hopeful that that can maybe help cast a more participatory vision for churches, just in terms of what it means for people to be able to participate in leadership, music ministry, without being the guy with the guitar.
Kelsey, welcome to the Churchfront Worship and Tech podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Kelsey, it's been a real joy to follow some of your work online. We met through Instagram and really through the connection we have with Worship Leader Research. Elias Dummer was a speaker at one of our conferences. I think he tagged you guys or one of your articles in one of his social posts, and I've been down the rabbit hole ever since, just diving deep into what you're putting out there. So I want our audience to get caught up to speed with who you are and what you do. So why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I am the worship correspondent for Christianity Today. That's usually my title there. But I write about issues related to musical worship, congregational singing, and the Christian music industry more broadly. I do a lot of research and reporting just in that area. I grew up as the child of church musicians going back a couple of generations. And so I have long loved church music, been involved in church music, and as I sort of progressed in the academic field, I wanted to study church music and write more about church music. So that's what I do now. I feel really lucky to be able to do it, and really lucky to be able to do it at a publication that is interested in producing reporting that doesn't just give out information, but also serves the church in a meaningful way. And that has just been a real sweet spot in terms of being able to report on some interesting trends, interesting things happening, but with an eye to helping church leaders and just the church more broadly know what to do with that information and ask better questions about what role music plays in our spiritual lives.
I love what's happening with both Christianity Today and Worship Leader Research. I feel like because I have a worship arts degree in my undergrad, and I feel like when I was in college, it wasn't as common to see research or studies being done about worship ministry. It just, your whole goal was kind of just become the best musician that you could be and lead a band, and that was kind of it. But there's all these question marks around the corporate gathering of worship. There's all these kind of interesting trends, like you mentioned. So I love that I'm starting to see more and more of that. How long have you been with Christianity Today writing for them?
I think my first article was published in January, February, March, one of those first couple months of 2021. So just kind of during pandemic era, because that was my first article was about kind of the spiritual challenge of virtual worship, virtual singing, virtual gathering. And so that was the first thing I ever wrote for them.
Yeah, I love it. Well, it's super exciting to just have you on and to share some of your insights. I have there were two articles on my list that you wrote that I was like, man, I've got to have her on. I've got to ask her some of her, findings from this. The first one was about the lack of worship leaders. And, this study was done, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was done around Southern Baptist churches specifically. But I would say, that could extend far, far greater than just the SBC, right? I think there's probably other churches and different demographics that are also feeling that tension. So can you fill me in on kind of where you got connected to that idea and started to pursue it and why that turned into kind of a piece that you were able to put together?
Yeah, that reporting was based on a study done by Will Bishop, who is a faculty member at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I think you might want to double check that. I'm pretty sure that's where he is. And he had done this just massive survey of worship leaders in Southern Baptist churches to understand a variety of things. And I mean, reading through this survey, the number of questions, I can't remember what it is, but he asked about everything from, what kinds of instruments turn up in special music, to how many times a year do you have a kids choir? How many times a year do you have an adult choir? Do you have a senior? I mean, there's like, I think the goal was to try to get as comprehensive a sense as he could of what musical life is like right now in Southern Baptist churches, because a similar survey was done at, in like the 1930s, I think is when the last one was. So he was just trying to gather this information. And there were a couple of there were a lot of really interesting findings, but there were a couple that, in reading it, really jumped out to me. And one of them was this problem that churches were articulating in their responses, was that they couldn't really identify many young people who were interested in going into music ministry. And that stood out to me for a couple of reasons. One, just sort of anecdotally, when I think about my experience as a young person in church, I could list off, and I did not go to a big church in my high school and middle school years, but there were a number of students who were mentored and trained and brought up, and were sort of brought into the fold of music ministry, partly because it was needed and partly because there was interest. And that was a big part of being part of the youth culture in our church, was this contingent of people being kind of brought into music ministry. And so to hear it articulated that there was just real lack of interest in general, widespread in the SBC, that was surprising to me. And so I wanted to talk to Will about that, wanted to talk to other educators about that, about what they're seeing at the college level, and also in local churches kind of at the high school and middle school level as well. Because I think for a lot of us, not all of us, but I think for a lot of us who ended up in music ministry or music ministry adjacent, that interest and passion usually begins pretty young. I don't know about if that was your experience at all. Because if you studied it in college, did you kind of grow into that through high school and middle school as well?
Yeah. I took piano lessons from probably 6 years old. And then I think I was 12 when my worship pastor saw me playing my guitar at church and was like, you should consider being a worship leader. And that's literally, he said that. And I don't think I ever thought I would do anything else. I was like, all right, well, I know I'm going to go do now, because Pastor Mike says I should go be a worship leader. So I'm going to go look at undergrad studies, and I'm going to become the best guitar and piano player I can be. And so that was like all I thought about. That was my story.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that is not all that uncommon of a story. And so the article that I wrote was a pretty shallow dive into that. That's something that I hope others can kind of take the baton and write more about, and we can start to understand. Obviously, that's an issue that will need to be kind of studied and see the fallout of that over time. But I do wonder, what is it that is feeding that problem? Why is there a shortfall? Is this like a temporary thing? Is this a problem of, musical culture in churches more broadly? Obviously, this is the SBC, which comes with its own particulars, but the SBC is big and, relatively diverse in some ways. So yeah. I think, and I think the observations made in the SBC probably do reflect things that are happening in non-SBC churches and the evangelical world and the non-denominational church world and stuff. So
do you think, because if I look back at kind of at least maybe the past 20-ish, 30-ish years of worship culture, like there was, the worship ministry of the church used to be a pretty large, involved, there were string groups, there were choirs, there were like performances, program, like larger programs with skits and things like that, and full, scripts that were involved. And that kind of went away. For at least, maybe not entirely, but there was a big resurgence, or not resurgence, but growth of kind of the contemporary rock band style, 5-piece band, maybe 2 or 3 frontline singers. And now, at least from my perspective, I'm also starting to see that there are some churches that are bringing back the small ensembles. They're starting to bring back like a small choir. Maybe it might not be as large as it used to be, but they want like more singers, more vocalists on stage. Do you think that that will shift that in terms of just a larger involvement than kind of the 5-piece rock band setup? Do you think that resurgence of choir and small ensembles will maybe shift the development or upbringing of worship leaders?
Gosh, it's hard to say. I am seeing something similar. I think there are a number of things driving that. If you think of some of the bigger worship kind of content creators right now, like Maverick City Music, or there's kind of a new one out of Nashville, the Choir Room. There is more interest in cultivating something choral, and that takes, it takes a lot of different forms right now. It's hard to know what that will look like long term. I don't know. I'm hopeful that can maybe help cast a more participatory vision for churches, just in terms of what it means for people to be able to participate in leadership and music ministry without being the guy with the guitar. I think there's been a pretty narrow path to music ministry that has been created by the contemporary worship music model of guy with guitar. Like if you think of, your Chris Tomlins, your Matt Redmans, the people who really, really rose up at the beginning of, the early 2000s, when this really started to take off as its own genre. That was the figurehead. That was the person. It was band driven, and you had band leader. But this more choral vision, even it's becoming more common to see worship leaders not holding an instrument at all. For a long time, that was pretty uncommon, especially to see a male vocalist up there without a microphone. That was really out of vogue for a while. It was sort of like, if you could hack it with a guitar and a couple of chords, you could be up there. But it was kind of this weird, I don't know if there was some stigma along with it or what, but yeah, I'm really interested to see how that might shift in the coming decade or so, whether we'll start to see more of these smaller worship choirs, might see bigger, praise teams of 5, 6, 7 people. I think there are a lot of churches where that has remained the norm. But in terms of like the biggest, most influential recording artists, that's kind of a relatively new thing. That I'm interested to see how it shakes out. It'll be interesting. But those other ensembles that you mentioned, though, strings, bands. Like when I was growing up, we had like a total hodgepodge church orchestra of like, I don't know, maybe 12 to 15 people. That was probably awful. I don't know. I played clarinet in it starting when I was like 11. So it couldn't have been that great, but it was like it was a fixture of like Christmas and Easter. And that seems to have really fallen away as well. I reported on the kind of closure of Lifeway's online platform this summer. Yeah. So Lifeway, which is the SBC's publishing arm, has its own version of like CCLI Song Select for its denominations. And one thing that it is highly regarded for is its orchestrations. But use of those things has really dropped off. The popularity of those things has dropped off. There's a lot less market for instrumental parts. And that's part of the decline in music education broadly. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's realistic to think that we'll see a resurgence of that kind of an ensemble, although I would love to, because I love that idea. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think through those transitions. I had honestly forgotten about Lifeway's closure, and even that they did print sheet music until you said that. That shows how fast things can move and transition and styles can change. But you're right. There's not a lot of heavy orchestration or ensembles that are being the one-offs at major large churches. They'll schedule a string quartet or something, but those are professionals in the industry. You're not running a church volunteer team with that setup. So I can imagine that it's a little bit more of an established infrastructure there to get the music that you need. So I'm curious as to even something that I kind of saw a string too between the lack of worship leaders and then the article you wrote about men singing in churches that we'll get to in a second. But do you think, because one of the pieces that they found was that even the programs, I think you interviewed whether it was a Colorado Christian University professor or it might have been the other guy from Baylor, I believe, that said that, they started with 8 or 10 worship arts, students in the programs. And then by the end of their program, there were only 2 left in the program. They had transitioned, left, changed majors, whatever it might have been. I mean, do you think that the church, from your perspective, and you've got a unique perspective based on your location and demographic and people that you attend with, but do you think that a worship leader is even like warranted these days in a church staff? I'd just be curious as to, we have a worship pastor on our staff, and I think a lot of churches do, but also I know a lot of churches don't. So, I mean, as you did that research and you saw, even schools are struggling to, keep that program even enticing for somebody to come and do and get educated, what's the missing piece in there, if you will?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things happening there. One is that a lot of churches, if they hire a full-time worship pastor, they don't require a degree that's in music.
Yeah.
That has become a lot more common to see someone on staff as a full-time worship leader or worship arts director. I mean, there are all these different titles. But it is becoming more and more common to not require a music degree and in fact, in some places, particularly some of these network churches, don't require a ministry degree at all,
right,
or do their own kind of in-house training and produce leaders that way. Not just worship pastors in general. So the question of what role education should play, whether higher education, this kind of training, what kind of music training is important. I think that's an open question. Will Bishop had some thoughts on that, the ways that, colleges and universities are trying to make the music education practical and relevant without losing some of the fundamentals. And that's an open debate among faculty, I will say. Some people have varying people have varying opinions about what kind of theory education, should you have to take music theory classes to get a degree in worship arts? Should you have to take the music history survey? And those are valid questions. So I think that's a piece of this. A piece of this is that these institutions of higher ed are seeing a decline in interest because there's less incentive. And some of those degrees are expensive and ministry doesn't pay well. So I have all of the sympathy in the world for someone who wants to go into ministry and is trying to decide, well, okay, if I want to go into ministry, what makes the most sense for me here? Can I go right into ministry basically through mentorship after high school? If I come on staff part-time at this church and am mentored by someone, do I need any more training than that? So that's part of this. The question of whether churches should have someone as a worship arts director, I think, is also an interesting one, because it's sort of asking, what kind of leadership should be required? What kind of leadership does music ministry require? Is this so plug and play now that we can just have these rotating teams of people, none of whom are on staff, none of whom are in any real kind of leadership position, but they can show up and put together a really nice set of music that is probably meaningful for a lot of people? Does that require a full-time person? And gosh, I think that is a question for someone who is really in, ministry to answer, because I have my sense of what you lose when you don't have someone like that. You lose the person at the top who's, casting vision, who is helping disciple worship leaders in the spiritual aspect of what they're doing. And my sense of it is that there is a real loss there for churches that don't have that. And I know that there are a lot of practical financial reasons why not every church can have it. But I do think that as music becomes a little bit more plug and play through, multi-tracks, all of these different systems that we have for churches to be able to produce these really slick music sets without a whole lot of preparation or even a lot of musical training, to give up some of the spiritual leadership of that process. I think there are a lot of really, I don't know, I think there are some implications there that we should be looking closely at.
Yeah. You'd have a great song leader / music director, but you wouldn't have pastoral oversight. And that can be, I think the church can feel that in probably a lack of formation, lack of kind of discipleship from the stage, if you will, or from the platform. That's really, really great insight. Worship leaders, production leaders, pastors, and volunteer teams. The Churchfront Conference is a 2-day conference created specifically for you. We bring in top shelf speakers from all around the country to speak on topics like worship tech, musicianship, theology, and leadership. At this event, you're going to be able to grow in your skill set as a worship or production leader, as well as connect with like-minded ministry leaders from all around the country who are just as passionate about serving their local church. Click the link to learn more and register your team today. I want to slightly pivot to the second piece that I found, most interesting. I think for me, they were connected in a unique way. And there's so much that I could ask you about this. But you wrote a second article about why men don't sing in church. So talk to me about the kind of the overall thesis and the premise of the article. Where did the inspiration come from on this guy? And how did it start turning into a piece that you wrote?
Yeah, well, so when I set out to write the piece, one of the central questions was, are men not singing because the music is effeminate? Like that's just this trope, cliche accusation that I have heard for years from a number of people, mostly online. But it pops up all the time. This going back to Mark Driscoll, the church is feminized, the church is overly emotional. These are Jesus is my boyfriend songs.
Yeah.
And, I look around and I know so many men who are worship leaders who have become worship leaders and musicians in this world and love this music. So there's something under that accusation, because are you saying all of the men who like this music are effeminate in some way, or what's going on here? And so that was kind of a starting place. I just wanted to dig underneath that a little bit to understand, and to just talk to educators who work with men who are musicians who like to sing and have been doing this for a long time, to try to put some words to is there anything new here? Are there some things that are particular to contemporary music of the past 10 years that are really off-putting to men in general? Or is something else going on here? And it started with that question. And as I talked with folks, it really took on a whole different flavor and went a whole different direction, which was what is hard about singing for men in church right now? Why is it hard to sing? And that's a problem that people have written about for a long time. I talked to my grandpa who's in his 80s.
I love it.
He, just sort of was like, men have never sung in church. He grew up going to a Lutheran church in rural Iowa. He's like, farmers don't sing in church. It just, so there were all kinds of little pieces to this. And, I don't know that the article, answers any big questions in a big way, but I think it kind of helps break down this kind of easy brush off, men don't sing because the music is too emotional. Men don't sing because this is effeminate. I think there's something deeper going on there, and it has a lot to do, at least based on the conversations I had, it has a lot to do with the just sort of expectations of men, of male voices, of the discomfort that comes along with having a voice that changes drastically in adolescence. I had not thought very deeply about that before, but everybody I talked to talked about the experience of being a man who goes through puberty and experiencing kind of losing control of your voice, being teased for losing control of your voice, and the kind of long-term effects of that and how you view yourself as a singer, as a musician, or as not a singer, someone who just shouldn't sing. And I thought that was interesting and sad in some ways, but also really hopeful, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I say those two pieces are connected, because as you talked about, the environment for the youth to be spoken into in terms of being called to ministry or called to musical leadership in the church, in terms of bringing up worship leaders, I thought, well, if boys and young adolescent men are being told in, upper elementary, lower junior high age that their voices are terrible and they shouldn't sing and they should sing in the back, like, it's no wonder that none of them develop into worship leaders, right? It's no wonder that then you see, I mean, I'm not sure that you see a influx of female worship leaders either, and they're not going through the same exact shifts in the same way that the boys are there in the puberty stage. But like, I was like, wow, if those two things are connected, all it takes is a language shift in, the schooling, in church environments to speak encouragement towards, boys just sticking it out, just being patient, instead of being, instead of teasing them or putting them in the back row kind of thing. But I just found that fascinating. And you pointed out one of the things that I had not really thought about, as, again, I've been in music for a long time and I've sang in choirs since I was really young. And so music and vocal pedagogy is just it's part of what I think about. It's part of kind of my normal upbringing. So it was when you pointed out that a lot of the contemporary tunes out there that we're singing in churches they involve scooping of the voice and kind of easing into a note or, vibrato. It involves all these technical pieces that are so much harder to execute than kind of a more rhythmic, stoic hymn would be, like a melodic idea of a hymn. My mind was like, whoa. I mean, pastorally planning out songs, I'm just like, I had never thought about the vocal technique that it would take to execute some of those things for your average, common dad or dude out there in the audience who feels more in that baritone register or bass register. And I mean, singing is probably uncommon, let alone like pop, it would feel super unnatural, be very intimidating. So I don't know if you have any more insight, but I thought that was a really unique piece of the article there.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've been singing for as long as I can remember, but I imagine, like, think of a song like Oceans, which is a kind of extreme example, but think about the way that song starts. Slow, kind of this intimate, breathy voice usually leading it. It's not always really clearly metered, very
Right.
stylized. Now imagine trying to sing that song in church. If you are someone who is having to sing an octave down, who is not a trained musician, you feel like your voice is intruding. Like, that was one thing that a couple of men with lower voices said, is like they feel like their voice is intruding in that space. Like, it doesn't belong there. It sticks out, and it's also like messing up what the singer up front is trying to do and what the singers around them are maybe trying to do. They feel like it's distracting, it's embarrassing, because this music just isn't meant to, it's not modeled on that kind of a voice. And you can really easily see how it starts to just feel like your voice does not belong there. There's no place for it there. And as more music, especially kind of the lower end energy wise, you just start to see how people feel like they just need to keep their voices down.
Yeah.
And so I think that's both sad and also just something that we need to be thinking about when it comes to how we program this music and what music is more or less useful for congregational worship. A lot of this music, I think we've just sort of allowed to be absorbed into the repertoire of churches because they're being made by these massive worship producers, when for particular churches, they just might not be very useful for inviting people into participatory worship.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you seen, I mean, even, I don't know if it was related to that article, but have you seen any kind of shift in that rubric of how people are picking those songs? I mean, I know Worship Leader Research just did a ton of that in their report about just how worship leaders select those songs and how they get introduced to those songs. But have you noticed anything, even just from your own observance of that rubric of song selection, congregational incorporation? Has that shifted at all?
It's hard to say. I'd say it's a real mixed bag right now.
Yeah.
Like I think it sort of feels like a wild west, because you have folks who are like going all in on the, like, we need modern hymns. We need modern hymns. We need to reteach part singing to get men singing, to get whole groups of people singing. So you have people going all the way there. Then you have, folks who just really like popular worship music, and their
Hmm.
churches, the people in those churches like this music. They listen to it. They find it really edifying and useful in their own devotional lives, and they want to find a way to incorporate that into congregational worship. I think there are some folks who don't, I think especially for worship leaders who are tenors, who don't have a hard time singing anything,
Yeah.
unless someone really kind of presses on them to think hard about what it would be like to sing this music with a different voice. I think some of it just, doesn't get examined from that point of view. I think, looking at the lyrics and how they maybe relate to a particular sermon series or a theme, that's a little bit easier than kind of thinking through some of those musical questions, especially if you just don't have to as a musician, if that
Right.
makes sense.
I always had to bring, because I'm like a upper baritone, low tenor, and so I can sing most of the things on the radio and stuff like that. But I always, as a worship pastor, I always had to actually call some of my like older male friends and ask them if they could sing certain parts in their register and be like, can you sing this? I mean, is this like way too high? Is this weird? Because I couldn't replicate that in my own voice. Like I was
Yeah.
cognizant enough to say, I don't want this to be too out of reach for the congregation to participate, but I can't even do it myself to like see how it feels just because my register was in a different spot. So I'd always be like, hey, Robbie, go ahead and sing this for me, but sing it in your register. And then I would hear him sing it, and he was a good friend, but it's just understanding how that actually sounds and feels. And he would tell me, we had a pretty good relationship, so he'd tell me if it felt weird or if it was a weird jump or something. But it's just
Mhm.
stuff that you don't, I mean, that stuff you can't learn in college, right? You're walking into that pretty experience base, if you will. So that's fascinating stuff. Fascinating. I love it.
Yeah. And there's no like easy answer to any of this, because, even proposing, well, we should go back to 4-part hymns because they have a
Right.
bass part, they have an alto part, they have a tenor part. Well, how many of the churches that we're talking about here have hymnals in the pew or in the chair back? And how many people are comfortable harmonizing and reading that bass line on the fly? Not many. Like that,
Yeah.
there's a level of like musical literacy assumed there. And so that's not the easy answer that some people think it is when they say, well, just go back to hymns. I don't know that that really solves your problem.
I'd be curious to note, though, I mean, that was a pretty traditional, common occurrence in. I mean, I grew up in a Baptist church where that was. I mean, it was just you pulled out the hymnal and that's what we sang from, and the
Mhm.
the voices of the men were boisterous. They were like, I mean, it was, and I would say, was that because music education was higher, or do you feel like there was just more freedom in consistency because it was all from a
Mhm.
hymnal? I mean,
Mhm.
I'd be curious to know your thoughts as to why you think that's kind of gone away.
Yeah. Well, I think familiarity is definitely a part of it. I mean,
Totally.
I think worship leader research, one of their early findings was about how quickly the churn of music coming through churches is right now. Just,
Insane.
and how and that's something we've been seeing for a while now. Just they don't have songs don't have much of a shelf life. Whereas
Mm,
if you have a hymnal that's updated every couple of decades,
yeah.
there's a more consistent body of music, and people like to sing what they know. I think that's definitely true. And comfort level with reading music, though, that just has to do with music education programs for one thing. But
Mm,
for a lot of people, church was that music education. So if
right.
you every Sunday were holding a hymnal and could kind of figure out how to track the notes, even if you weren't all that musically trained, or you're hearing people around you, you get comfortable to harmonizing. I learned how to harmonize in church before I learned how to read, sight read an alto line.
Hmm.
So I think there are a couple of pieces there, but I think you're right about the familiarity piece for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it.
You mentioned that there are some groups kind of trying to do the modernizing hymns piece and 4-part harmony. What I'm curious, I don't know of any of them. Can you tell me some of those that are sticking out to you right now in the music space?
Yeah, well, I think some of the music coming out of like, the Gettys, for example,
Yeah.
their music they would refer to as sort of modern hymns.
Yep.
Matt Boswell, Matt Papa, Sovereign Grace,
Right.
those kind. I'm not. I know City of Light. I think they're a UK based group.
Yeah.
They do music in this flavor as well. Um, that lends itself to 4-part harmony, but also has a pretty predictable structure. I think,
Right.
when people think about hymnody, that's one thing they think of is this very clearly um, delineated form that
Right.
can, these verses and maybe a refrain. So I think there are groups that are trying to make that a part of what they do. I mean, you run into kind of the really neo-reformed pastors online who are in places like Moscow, Idaho, who are very performatively trying to create this culture of part singing in their churches,
Yeah.
um, and that that's a choice, and that's a culture that you can create, but it takes a lot of effort, and everybody has to be on board, and I think that's such a specific cultural choice to make for a church, which is
Right.
fine. But I think a group like the Gettys, they're kind of trying to bridge that gap between, you know, the more extreme version of that and outfitting modern, churches that are set up to do contemporary worship music, kind of bringing back some of this really, text-driven hymnody, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I mean, but I had not thought of the connection between the language there, but you're right. Papa and Boswell and Geddes, they're writing a lot. And Merker, I think, is another Matt Merker. We've had him on the show before. They're writing a ton of modern day hymns, and it is very unique. It's a different, it definitely stands not in a negative way, I don't think, but in contrast to some of the contemporary stuff that we hear on K-Love and the radio, and
Mhm.
it feels different. It's structured different. The flow and the kind of the meter of the song, even if it's in the same time signature as a Chris Tomlin tune, feels different to sing. And
Mhm.
so I just had not put two and two together, but that is so true that really is modern hymnody kind of coming back into the picture, if you will.
Yeah, and I'd say like, they're very text and theme dense,
Yeah,
they and that's a goal.
right.
I think there is this interest in enriching contemporary worship music with a little bit more thematic theological density.
Hmm.
Um, and for people in that camp, you know, the text is really important, adding
Yeah,
adding more ideas. Um, and again, that's one way to
right.
theologically enrich worship. I don't think it's the only way, but I think there is this pendulum swing back and forth where folks like Keith Getty might look at contemporary worship music that is more sparse in its text and more repetitive, and think that is, sort of vapid or
Mm,
devoid of content, which I don't think is necessarily true.
right.
And then, folks on the other side will look at something like coming out of the Gettys and just say that is so many words. More words do not make a song better or more worshipful. When I would say, the beauty of that is that we have people making both. And I think
Yeah,
for many churches, a song like, This Is the Air I Breathe can coexist quite peacefully alongside a song like In Christ Alone.
yeah.
They do different things, um, and yeah, so I see no reason why it can't be both.
Yeah, I love that insight, and I think that's a great insight for our listeners too. I mean, as church leaders, planning services, just being, again, I think the work that you are doing at CT and and the work that the guys are doing over at Worship Leader Research, and just all of the studies coming out and kind of observances are so helpful, like to
Mhm.
pay attention. So what are, I have a couple kind of last minute, maybe rapid fire pieces that I'd love to ask you. One, what are you paying attention to right now? What is a trend that you're observing, or something that you're passionate about right now, in the worship or tech space, that you're just kind of, maybe you're digging down for an article, maybe you're just kind of peeping behind the curtain, seeing what's going on. Anything catching your eye right now?
Mhm. Yeah. I'm really interested in the way that social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, the way that audio visual content is shaping the way we think about musical worship,
Mm,
the way that visual aesthetics are shaping the way that we think about contemporary worship music, what worship looks like and feels like. I think content on places like TikTok is becoming more and more influential. I think of a group like Jaywalkers. Are you familiar with
mm-mm,
Jaywalkers?
no.
Uh, they recently collaborated with Maverick City Music, and from what I can tell, they basically started as like an influencer group, an influencer house, and
Okay.
have really been able to leverage their content into a full blown kind of worship music career for themselves.
Cool.
Um, and it will be really interesting to see if we see more of that,
Yeah.
it's like this sort of like worship influencer space. I'm curious to see how that's going to continue to grow and change over the next couple of years. That's still relatively new, but I do think that will probably be a pretty powerful way that young people encounter worship music. Which relates back to this, idea of how people come into worship ministry or not. So
Right.
that's something I'm really, really curious about, and keeping an eye on.
Man. Where do you kind of keep up to speed with what's out there right now? I mean, I know social media obviously is a huge platform of just,
Yeah.
man, go down the algorithm, what it feeds you, go down your search, your recommended. But are there any, obviously Worship Leader Research and CT are doing great work. Are there any other platforms that would be helpful to kind of stay in the know of what's, what studies are being done, what research is out there, anything that you subscribe to that would be another platform or area for research to come about?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, the crazy thing about right now is, worship leader research, what CT is doing, the contemporary worship music industry is so new.
Hmm.
Um, the research into it is relatively new.
Yeah.
Now, I can recommend, there are a couple of people who have been studying this for longer than I have, whose work I
Okay.
highly recommend. Monique Ingalls is an ethnomusicologist from Baylor she has a book called Singing the Congregation. So for anyone interested in doing sort of an academic deep
Oh,
dive, she is
cool.
to go look at her writing, and her book in
What's it
particular
called
is,
again?
it's called Singing the Congregation, I
Okay.
believe. Um, so I would, she is someone who's done academic work that predates mine. Lester Ruth is another individual whose books you can find. He's written quite a bit. He has a collected volume called Flow. It's
Hmm.
about worship music, contemporary worship music. Um, Another person you can, well, follow the whole worship leader research team.
Yeah.
They all have their own work in varying fields. Some of them are academic, some of them are practitioners, some of them are industry folks. So you can go follow them. They're all listed on their website. um, and let's see what else. um, a research, an outlet like Religion News Service. Bob
Yeah.
Smetana is a reporter over there who writes widely about evangelicalism in the church, and they do a lot of really great news reporting and research on what's happening in the church. So those kinds of places are where I would go. Trying to find like news and what's happening on social media, I feel like it's just a tidal wave of information. So you can, go follow your favorite worship artists and see where that takes you in the
Yeah.
algorithm.
Yep.
You know, Trying to find anything in particular is difficult. And I cannot remember who, this is not my quote, but one of my favorite sort of research quotes is, social media is not social science. So I try not to, hang too much of my research just on what's happening on social
Right.
media. But it is an interesting place to kind of keep track of trends and
Yeah.
what's here and there.
I just remember Elias said something at the conference. He spoke back. I'll link to the episode in the show notes too. But he spoke back at the conference in October, and he said one of the things that he was mentioning kind of off stage was it feels like worship leaders and ministers have been kind of living in a little bit of like a bubble for a while. And so there, all this worship leader research that has come out and some of the articles for CT, it's like, it's kind of starting to wake us up again, if you will, pop the bubble a little bit and just kind of show us like, here's what you're saying about your role. Here's the things that we're finding from surveys. And, as you've done study for CT articles, there's all sorts of things that should be kind of, they should kind of perk our ears, awaken our minds a little bit as to what some of these results and findings mean for our leadership roles in the church and how we pastor, how we lead, how we interact with volunteers, how we interact with our congregation. So I really, the reason I asked that question about where you kind of find yourself doing research is because I think worship leaders should be doing research as well. They should be paying attention to some of these findings and asking themselves, what does this mean for me and my church in light of these kind of more, maybe not global, but maybe national trends and findings that people are seeing. And so thank you for sharing some of those resources, because I think it'll be good for our audience to kind of go down their own rabbit trail. I'll link them in the show notes in the description of the video and the audio version of these podcasts. So thanks for just kind of letting us behind the curtain there.
Yeah, of course. I think for myself and everybody else doing this research, we really want to help leaders and church musicians just ask better questions, ask better questions about the music that we're using and what it's for, what it does, what it means to people. And so, yeah, it's really fun to see sort of a growing body of research in this area and really fun to contribute to it too.
Yeah. Kelsey, I want to point people to be able to connect with you, follow you, all the things that you put out there online. So what's the best place and platform for them to catch up with you on?
Yeah, you can I'm on Instagram and Threads. That's where most of my stuff is. I'm still on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling.
Yeah. What do you think about Threads these days? Like, as you've been on both X and Threads, what are your takeaways? I'm so curious.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm sort of in this weird space. I think a lot of writers are, where we're still kind of like trying to remain active on all of them until we find out what happens.
Yeah.
And I'm still kind of finding people on Threads. It still feels a little bit like everyone is just like looking for their people. And so I feel like I haven't quite got the hang of it yet. I'm actually really sad to see X start to go away, because I had managed to find a really great cohort of songwriters, musicians, researchers who were willing to have really thoughtful conversations on Twitter. And so far, I have not been able to find that exact sweet spot on Threads, but I'm hopeful that it will start to show up. But most of my writing and research, and I am trying to get more in the hang of creating video content, is on Instagram and Threads. You can also find me on TikTok under my name. So any of those places.
Cool. Go follow Kelsey. She is a great follow. She's doing great stuff. And every time your post, comes a story or whatnot comes up on my feed, I'm watching it, because I'm like, whatever research you've got and even stuff about your book coming out. So tell people about, if they're interested in, I want them to know the full Kelsey story. So tell them about the other work that you're working on now.
Yeah. So if you follow me on Instagram, you'll find that I have content in two areas. One is the worship related content that I do for CT and other kind of research I'm doing there on music. But I'm also working on a book on the history of Christian parenting literature. So I had started working on this project last year, looking into the story of how popular Christian parenting literature from people like James Dobson, where that came from, what some of the underlying theologies and ideologies are of that. And so my co-author on that is Marissa Burt. And there will be some worship research adjacent stuff there, like about how we should think about children and worship and formation in the church. That's one area
Mm.
where these interests intersect. I have a big passion of mine is talking about how to include children in the worship of the church, and how to both include them and empower them to ask good questions and to be really thoughtful about how they engage with their faith at a really young age. And so, anyway, that is a book that is not coming out anytime soon. It'll probably be a good year and a half before anyone sees that book. But we are really excited about it, and you will see a bit of content there on that topic as well.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I'm super excited for all of it. And really, I can't thank you enough for just the work that you've done so far. And in my short time of knowing you online, I've just really been blessed by being able to read some of the content, see some of the findings that you've done. And I know it just takes time. So thank you for putting the time and the effort and the energy into it and making it available for us. So if you want to check out Kelsey's work, go check out her profile, and we'll put links to the articles mentioned here in the show notes below, and to Christianity Today, so you can check out more of her writings. And anywhere else you would point them to, Kelsey? I might be missing another place, but that's sufficient.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks so much. So enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show, Kelsey. We'll have to have you back sometime, and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, okay?
Sounds good. Thanks.